The morning fog rolled thick across the Pacific waters, obscuring everything beyond 30 feet. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the cliff, her weathered hands gripping the wooden railing she and her son had built 3 years ago. The salt air filled her lungs as she squinted toward the horizon, searching for the supply boat that came every 2 months. But it wasn't due for another 3 weeks. So when she heard the distant rumble of an engine cutting through the silence, her stomach tightened with unease. Before we continue with Sarah's story, if you're enjoying this tale of isolation, survival, and unexpected encounters, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more compelling stories like this one. Her son Marcus emerged from their cabin, wiping sleep from his eyes. The morning routine had been interrupted, and she could see the concern already forming in his expression. He'd learned to read the subtle shifts in their environment just as she had, understanding that unexpected visitors on Ravens Point rarely brought good news. The island had been their sanctuary for 3 years now, a place where they could exist without judgment, without the constant reminders of the tragedy that had upended their lives in Seattle. Sarah remembered the day they'd first arrived, how the lighthouse had seemed almost haunting in its isolation, the keeper's cottage run down and filled with decades of neglect. Her grandfather had maintained it impeccably until his death, but in the 5 years before Sarah inherited it, the property had deteriorated. Those first months had been brutal, filled with physical labor that left her hands blistered and her body aching. But the work had been therapeutic, giving her something tangible to focus on when grief threatened to overwhelm her completely. Marcus had struggled initially, 12 years old and angry at the world that had taken his father. He'd thrown himself into destructive patterns in Seattle, fighting at school, withdrawing from friends, his grades plummeting. The therapists had used words like trauma response and complicated grief, but Sarah had simply seen her son slipping away from her. The decision to leave the city, to isolate themselves on this remote island, had been desperate. Many had called it extreme, even harmful. Her sister had accused her of running away, of depriving Marcus of the support systems he needed. But Sarah had known, deep in her bones, that her son needed space to heal, away from the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed them everywhere in their old neighborhood. At 17, he'd grown tall and lean, his skin bronzed from years under the island's sun. He'd been 12 when they first arrived at Ravens Point, a small island off the coast of Washington State, inheriting it from Sarah's grandfather, along with the responsibility of maintaining the historic lighthouse that still guided ships through treacherous waters. The transformation in Marcus over these 3 years had been remarkable. The angry, grief-stricken boy had evolved into a thoughtful young man, someone who understood the value of solitude without letting it consume him. The lighthouse itself had become more than just a structure to maintain. It represented continuity, purpose, and connection to something larger than their personal tragedy. Built in 1892, it had weathered countless storms, guided thousands of ships safely through the treacherous waters off the Washington coast. Sarah's great-great-grandfather had been the original keeper, beginning a family tradition that had lasted over a century. When her own grandfather passed away, leaving her the property, Sarah had initially viewed it as a burden, another complication in a life already overwhelmed by loss and responsibility. Now she understood it was a gift, a lifeline thrown to them in their darkest moment. "Marcus, we have visitors," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the caution that had become second nature to them. He moved beside her, his movements economical and sure, no longer the clumsy adolescent who'd first arrived on the island. Together they watched as a sleek yacht materialized through the fog, far too expensive and out of place for these waters. The boat was at least 60 feet long, gleaming white fiberglass and chrome that spoke of wealth and privilege. It dropped anchor in the protected cove below, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten. This was private property. The lighthouse keeper's residence had stood here for over a century, and while they welcomed the occasional researcher or historian who called ahead, uninvited guests were rare and often meant trouble. The island had strict conservation protections, home to nesting colonies of tufted puffins, rhinoceros auklets, and pigeon guillemots. The breeding season was particularly sensitive, and human disturbance could cause the birds to abandon their nests entirely. 4 people disembarked into an inflatable dinghy, their laughter carrying across the water with a careless quality that immediately set Sarah's teeth on edge. She could make out designer outdoor gear, the kind sold at upscale sporting goods stores to people who would never actually use it for anything more demanding than a photo opportunity. Expensive cameras hung from their necks, and one of them was already filming with what looked like a professional video rig. Tourists, wealthy ones, who probably thought the whole world was their personal playground, unconstrained by rules that applied to ordinary people. She exchanged a glance with Marcus, who had learned to read her expressions perfectly over their years of isolation. He nodded slightly, understanding the unspoken message. Be polite but firm. They needed to leave. Sarah had dealt with trespassers before, though never in such an expensive boat. Usually it was kayakers who'd gotten lost or fishermen seeking shelter from unexpected storms. Those encounters had been straightforward, people generally apologetic once they understood they were on private property. But something about this group, their confident laughter, the way they moved with absolute certainty that they belonged wherever they chose to go, told Sarah this would be different. Sarah and Marcus made their way down the steep path carved into the cliff face, their feet finding purchase on stones they'd walked thousands of times. The path was treacherous for newcomers, slick with morning dew and moss, but Sarah and Marcus navigated it with practiced ease. By the time they reached the small dock, weathered planks that Marcus had helped repair last summer, the visitors were already tying up their dinghy with the kind of sloppy knots that made Marcus wince. He'd learned proper seamanship from old Jim Hendricks, the supply boat captain, and took pride in doing things correctly. Two couples, probably in their 40s, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never being told no. The men wore expensive sailing jackets with brands Sarah recognized from luxury catalogs. The women carried designer bags impractical for island exploration. One of them was already complaining about getting her shoes wet on the rocks. "This is private property," Sarah announced as they approached, keeping her voice level but firm. She'd learned over the years that confrontation didn't require aggression, just clear boundaries and the willingness to enforce them. The lighthouse and surrounding land aren't open to the public. You'll need to turn around and leave. A man in an expensive jacket looked up, surprise flickering across his tanned face before being replaced by an expression of mild annoyance, as if Sarah were an unexpected inconvenience rather than the property owner asserting her rights. "Oh, we didn't realize anyone actually lived here," he said, his tone suggesting this was somehow Sarah's fault for not making their presence more obvious. "We're just doing some photography for a travel blog. We'll only be an hour or two." His tone suggested he expected immediate compliance, as if Sarah's concerns were merely a formality to be brushed aside. He pulled out his phone, presumably to show her his blog, as if social media credentials somehow granted him special access to private property. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Sarah responded, maintaining her composure despite the frustration building inside her. "As I said, this is private property. My family has owned this island for over a century. There are also protected bird colonies nesting here. Human disturbance during breeding season can cause serious harm to the wildlife. You'll need to leave immediately." The second man, wearing sunglasses despite the fog that still clung to everything, laughed dismissively. "Come on, there's nothing but rocks and trees here. What's the harm in a few photos? We've come all the way from California. Do you know how expensive it is to charter a yacht? We're not leaving without getting something for our money." The entitlement in his voice was staggering. The assumption that his financial investment somehow superseded Sarah's legal rights and the environmental protections in place. Marcus stepped forward, and Sarah felt a surge of pride at how he carried himself. No longer the scared boy who'd arrived here seeking refuge from a world that had been cruel to them both. His shoulders were squared, his voice steady and mature beyond his years. "Sir, my mom already said no. You're trespassing. We have signs posted at every reasonable approach to the island. Ignorance of the law isn't an excuse to break it. I suggest you respect that and leave now, before this becomes a bigger problem than it needs to be." One of the women, with perfectly styled blonde hair that seemed absurdly out of place on the windswept dock, pulled out her phone and frowned at the screen. "There's no cell service here. How do you people even survive?" Her tone dripped with condescension, as if Sarah and Marcus were curiosities rather than human beings with legitimate boundaries. She looked around at the island with barely concealed disdain, clearly unable to comprehend why anyone would choose this lifestyle. "The island has no amenities, no restaurants, no shopping. What do you even do all day?" "We manage just fine," Sarah said, her patience wearing thin. The ignorance and entitlement on display was breathtaking. "Now, please, leave before I have to call the Coast Guard on our radio. We have their direct frequency, and they take trespassing on protected coastal areas very seriously. There are substantial fines involved, not to mention potential criminal charges, if you've disturbed any of the nesting birds." The first man held up his hands in mock surrender, a patronizing smile on his face. All right. No need to get hostile. We're just trying to appreciate nature here. But you're missing out on some great publicity. Our blog has over 2 million followers. We could put this place on the map. Think about the exposure. You could probably turn this into a bed and breakfast or something. Actually make some money instead of just hiding away from the world." "It's already on the map," Marcus said dryly, gesturing toward the lighthouse. "That's why ships don't crash into the rocks anymore. It's called navigation. And we're not interested in your kind of exposure. Some places are valuable precisely because they're not overrun with tourists taking selfies." The woman who'd complained about cell service let out an exasperated sigh. "This is ridiculous. We're in the middle of nowhere, and you're acting like we're trying to rob you. We just want a few pictures. You're being completely unreasonable. In what world is it normal to live like hermits on a rock in the ocean?" Don't you have any consideration for people who actually want to experience natural beauty? The hypocrisy of her statement was stunning. Sarah bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips, reminding herself that engaging further would only prolong the encounter. Experience natural beauty by trespassing on protected land and potentially harming endangered seabird colonies? But that's not appreciation, that's exploitation. Now, for the last time, you need to leave. This is your final warning before I contact the authorities. As the visitors retreated to their dinghy, grumbling about unfriendly locals and wasted fuel, making sure Sarah and Marcus could hear their complaints, Sarah felt the familiar weight of isolation settle back over her shoulders. But it was different now, tinged with a new awareness. These people, with their casual entitlement and their assumption that money and social media followers granted them access to everything, represented exactly what she and Marcus had been escaping. This was why they'd come here, why she'd chosen this life for Marcus when his father's death had shattered their world in Seattle. The city had become suffocating after Daniel's death. He'd been a construction supervisor, killed when scaffolding collapsed on a downtown building project. The investigation had revealed criminal negligence by the contractor, safety violations that had been repeatedly ignored. The settlement had been substantial, but it had also been eaten away by medical bills from Daniel's 3 days in intensive care before he died, funeral costs and the legal fees involved in the wrongful death lawsuit. By the time everything was settled, Sarah had barely enough left to maintain their small house in the suburbs. But the real damage hadn't been financial. It had been watching Marcus implode, watching her bright, curious son become withdrawn and angry. The school had been understanding at first, making accommodations for his grief. But as months passed and his behavior worsened, fighting with other students, skipping classes, his grades collapsing, their patience had worn thin. The final straw had come when Marcus was suspended for pushing another boy down a flight of stairs. The other child hadn't been seriously hurt, but it had been a wake-up call for Sarah. Her son was spiraling, and nothing she tried was helping. The therapist they'd been seeing suggested intensive treatment, possibly even residential care. The school counselor had hinted that Marcus might need to be transferred to an alternative program for troubled youth. Everyone had opinions and advice, but Sarah had felt increasingly desperate and alone. Then she'd received the letter from her grandfather's attorney, informing her that she'd inherited Ravens Point. At first, it had seemed like just another burden, another complication. But as she'd researched the property, learned about its history, seen photos of the lighthouse and the wild coastline, something had shifted inside her. What if they just left? What if they removed themselves entirely from the environment that was destroying her son? It was extreme, possibly even irresponsible. Her sister had been horrified, accusing Sarah of running away from Marcus's problems instead of facing them. Friends had warned that isolation could make things worse, that Marcus needed professional help, not exiled to a remote island. But Sarah had trusted her instincts, and now, 3 years later, she knew she'd made the right choice. Here, on Ravens Point, they could breathe, they could heal. But it also meant moments like this, where the outside world crashed against their sanctuary uninvited, reminding them that not everyone understood or respected the boundaries they'd established. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in their small but well-equipped kitchen, the familiar rituals providing comfort after the unsettling encounter, Marcus sat at the wooden table they'd salvaged from the old keeper's quarters, working through his correspondence courses. The table had been buried under years of accumulated junk when they'd first arrived, but Marcus had spent weeks carefully restoring it, sanding away decades of neglect, treating the wood until it gleamed. It was one of many projects that had helped him channel his anger into something productive during those difficult first months. The kitchen itself had been completely renovated over their 3 years here. When they had arrived, it had been barely functional, with an ancient stove that barely worked and cabinets that were falling apart. Sarah and Marcus had taught themselves basic carpentry through online videos, slowly transforming the space into something warm and efficient. The window above the sink looked out over the cove, and Sarah never tired of the view, watching the way light played across the water, the seabirds diving for fish, the occasional seal popping its head above the surface. She'd worried initially about his education, about the social isolation, questioning whether she was sacrificing his future for his present well-being. The correspondence courses had been a compromise, allowing him to work at his own pace while still meeting educational requirements. But Marcus had thrived here in ways she never anticipated. Without the social pressures and distractions of traditional school, without the constant reminders of his father's death, he'd rediscovered his natural curiosity and intelligence. He'd become an excellent student, teaching himself advanced mathematics and programming through online courses when their satellite internet cooperated. He'd read more books in 3 years on the island than he had in his entire childhood before. More importantly, he'd found peace, something that had seemed impossible in those dark months after Daniel's death. "Mom," Marcus said, looking up from his laptop where he'd been working through a calculus problem, "do you ever think about what we're missing?" Out there, I mean. He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the mainland invisible beyond the water. Sarah paused, her knife hovering over the carrot she was chopping, considering how to answer honestly without dismissing his feelings. Every day, she admitted. I think about your father, about the life we had planned, about the friends I lost touch with when we moved here. I think about theater performances and farmers markets and just being able to walk into a store when I need something. But then I think about what we found here. Do you feel like you're missing something important? He considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful in a way that reminded her achingly of Daniel. Her husband had had that same quality, the ability to sit with difficult questions rather than rushing to easy answers. Sometimes, Marcus said slowly, I wonder what it would be like to have friends my age, to go to a regular school dance, to play on a sports team, to just be normal. I see things online, videos of kids my age doing regular teenager stuff, and I feel this weird disconnect, like I'm from a different world or something. But then I think about who I was becoming in Seattle after Dad died. The fights, the anger, the way I couldn't focus on anything except how unfair everything was, the way I hurt that kid, pushed him down the stairs. I could have really injured him. I was so angry all the time, and I didn't know how to stop. Here, I can breathe, I can think, I can actually feel like myself again, or maybe for the first time. Does that make sense? That's all I wanted for you, Sarah said softly, setting down her knife and moving to sit across from him at the table. After your father's accident, watching you spiral, seeing that angry, hurt child where my sweet boy used to be, I felt so helpless. The therapists, the school counselors, everyone had advice, but nothing was working. You were slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to reach you. When I inherited this place, everyone thought I was crazy for considering moving here. My sister practically staged an intervention, said I was being selfish and irresponsible. But I looked at you, and I knew we needed something drastic. We needed space to fall apart and put ourselves back together without an audience. This place saved us both. It gave us permission to grieve without performing for anyone, to heal at our own pace, to remember who we were before everything fell apart. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a gesture that would have been impossible 3 years ago when touch itself had felt threatening to him. Thanks for taking the risk, Mom. I know it wasn't easy. I know people judged you for it. But you were right. I needed this. We both did. The moment was interrupted by a sound that made them both tense. The yacht engine, returning. Sarah moved to the window and felt her stomach drop. The boat was back, circling the island slowly and deliberately. This wasn't tourists nursing wounded pride. This was reconnaissance. The next morning brought clearer skies, the fog finally lifting to reveal the full expanse of ocean surrounding their island home. The weather change should have been welcome, but instead, Sarah found herself tense, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. She'd slept poorly, troubled by dreams of strangers invading their home, of losing Raven's Point to forces she couldn't control. When she climbed to the lighthouse at dawn to check the equipment, she understood why her instincts had been screaming warnings. The yacht was back, and this time it wasn't attempting to anchor or approach the dock. Instead, it circled the island slowly and methodically, and through her binoculars, Sarah could see people on deck with professional cameras and what looked like surveying equipment. They were taking measurements, documenting angles, photographing every aspect of Raven's Point from the water. The behavior was calculated, purposeful, and deeply unsettling. Marcus, Sarah called down the spiral staircase that wound through the heart of the lighthouse. They're back, and they're up to something. Together, they watched from the cliff as the yacht completed 2 full circles of the island before finally moving off toward the mainland. The entire operation had taken nearly an hour, thorough and professional. But Sarah's unease didn't dissipate with their departure. Something about the methodical way they'd surveyed Raven's Point felt calculated, purposeful, like preparation for something larger. These weren't just disappointed tourists nursing wounded pride. This was reconnaissance, documentation, the kind of detailed information gathering that preceded legal action or development plans. What do you think they were doing? Marcus asked, his voice carrying an edge of worry that Sarah hadn't heard in months. Their peaceful routine had been disrupted, and the uncertainty was clearly affecting him. I don't know, Sarah admitted, lowering the binoculars. But I don't like it. People don't spend that much time and effort documenting a place unless they have plans for it. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. First thing tomorrow, I'm calling the Coast Guard to file a formal trespassing report. We need this documented officially. Her instincts proved correct 3 days later when a certified letter arrived with the monthly supply drop. The boat captain, old Jim Hendricks, who'd been making this run for 30 years, navigating these waters through storms and fog with the kind of skill that came from decades of experience, handed it over with a sympathetic expression that immediately put Sarah on edge. Looks official, Sarah. Everything okay out here? You and the boy doing all right? We were, Sarah said, her hands trembling slightly as she took the thick envelope. The weight of it felt ominous, substantial. "Thanks for bringing it, Jim." Jim lingered, clearly concerned. "You need anything, you've got my radio frequency. Don't hesitate to call. I've seen these developers before, Sarah. They're ruthless. They don't care about families or history or anything except their bottom line." Sarah's stomach dropped. "How did you know it was from developers?" Jim's weathered face creased with worry. "Word gets around on the water. Those folks who were here last week, they've been asking questions at the marina, making inquiries about Ravens Point, about the ownership, about the lighthouse. Folks recognize them as scouts for Pacific Coast Ventures. That's a big development company out of California. They've bought up several lighthouse properties along the coast in the last few years, turned them into exclusive resorts for rich people. The locals usually get pushed out, priced out, or sued out." Sarah felt cold despite the warm summer sun. "Thanks for the warning, Jim. We'll be careful." Marcus read over her shoulder as she opened the envelope with shaking hands, both of them standing on the dock as the supply boat pulled away. The letter was from a law firm in Seattle, thick with legal jargon and corporate letterhead that screamed expensive lawyers. They represented a development company called Pacific Coast Ventures, and they were claiming that while Sarah owned the lighthouse and immediate grounds, approximately 2 acres, the rest of Ravens Point, the remaining 40 acres, was actually public land that had reverted to federal ownership decades ago. They'd filed permits to develop it into an exclusive resort, complete with luxury accommodations, a spa, and private marina. The letter demanded that Sarah and Marcus vacate the property within 90 days or face legal action for trespassing on federal land. It was dated 2 days after the tourists had first appeared on their island. "This is impossible," Sarah breathed, her mind racing through everything she knew about the property's history. "My grandfather's deed covers the entire island. I have the documents. I've been paying property taxes on all 42 acres for 3 years. How can they claim it's public land?" "Then you'll need to prove it in court, and that takes money and time," Jim said gently, his voice heavy with experience and sympathy. "I've seen it happen to fishing families up and down the coast, people whose families have worked these waters for generations. These development companies, they've got lawyers who can twist anything around. They find some loophole, some old boundary dispute, some obscure regulation that nobody's thought about in decades, and suddenly people who've lived somewhere for generations are out on the street. They file motion after motion, drag everything out until the legal fees bankrupt you. Then they swoop in and buy the property for pennies on the dollar when you're forced to sell to cover your debts. It's a strategy, and it works more often than not." Marcus's face had gone pale, and Sarah could see the old fear creeping back into his eyes, the anxiety that they'd worked so hard to overcome. "Are we going to lose our home, Mom? Is this happening again? First we lost Dad, then we lost our house in Seattle when the bills piled up, and now this? How is this fair?" Sarah pulled him close, fighting back her own tears. "We're not losing anything," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We're going to fight this. We have the law on our side. We have the truth. That has to count for something." But even as she said it, Sarah knew how naive that sounded. The truth didn't always win, especially not against corporations with unlimited resources and political connections. Still, what choice did they have? This island wasn't just property to them. It was their sanctuary, their healing place, the home they'd built from grief and determination. They couldn't just walk away without fighting. That night, Sarah barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and fears. She spent hours in the small office attached to their cabin, the room that had once been a storage closet but which they'd converted into a workspace. The desk was covered with documents now, pulled from the old filing cabinets her grandfather had left behind. She went through every piece of paper related to the property, some of them yellowed with age, the ink fading but still legible. The original deed from 1892, when the lighthouse was built, her great-great-grandfather's name written in elegant script across the top. Her grandfather's will, clear and unambiguous in leaving her the entire island. Tax records going back decades, proof that the family had been paying taxes on all 42 acres continuously. Property surveys from 1920, 1957, and 1989, each confirming the boundaries. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The Mitchell family owned all of Ravens Point, not just the lighthouse grounds. But as she read through the development company's legal filing more carefully, squinting at the dense legal language in the dim lamplight, she began to see their strategy. It was creative, she had to admit. They were claiming that an 1897 amendment to maritime law had actually transferred ownership of all lighthouse properties to the federal government, making the families simply caretakers rather than owners. Furthermore, they argued that a 1963 policy had opened these properties to commercial development once they were automated and no longer required full-time keepers. Since Ravens Point Lighthouse had been automated in 1972, they claimed the land had been available for development for over 50 years. and the Mitchell family's continued presence was actually illegal, squatting on federal property. It was creative legal fiction, carefully constructed to sound plausible. But Sarah could see the holes in it. If the land had truly transferred to federal ownership, why had her family continued to pay property taxes? Why had the county continued to assess and collect those taxes? Why had her grandfather's will been processed through probate court without any challenge from the federal government? Why had she been able to take out a small loan using the property as collateral 3 years ago when they'd needed to repair the lighthouse's foundation? It was creative legal fiction, but Sarah could see how it might work in front of the wrong judge. The average person couldn't afford to fight a well-funded development company in court for years. They'd simply wear you down with legal fees and delays and motions until you gave up, sold out, or went bankrupt. That's what they were counting on. They'd probably done this successfully dozens of times before. Jim had mentioned they'd taken over several other lighthouse properties. How many families had they pushed out? How many histories had they erased? Marcus found her at dawn, still surrounded by papers, her eyes red from exhaustion and suppressed tears. The coffee pot was empty, suggesting she'd been up all night. "Mom, you need to sleep," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I need to save our home," Sarah replied, her voice breaking slightly despite her attempts to maintain composure. "This is all we have, Marcus. After your father died, after we lost everything to medical bills and funeral costs, after we had to sell our house in Seattle just to stay afloat, this island was our second chance. This was supposed to be safe. This was supposed to be ours. I can't let some greedy developers take it away because they see a profit opportunity. I won't let them erase us the way they've probably erased dozens of other families." "Then we'll fight," Marcus said with a determination that reminded Sarah achingly of his father. Daniel had had that same quality, that refusal to back down when something important was at stake. "We'll find a way. We'll get a lawyer, document everything, make them prove their claims. They're counting on us giving up, right? So we don't give up. We fight every step of the way." The first step was hiring a lawyer, which meant dipping into the small savings Sarah had managed to accumulate from her freelance writing work. She'd been building up a fund for Marcus's college education, money they couldn't really afford to spend on legal fees, but what choice did they have? She spent 2 days making calls, explaining their situation, and facing rejection after rejection. Most lawyers didn't want to take on a case against Pacific Coast Ventures. The company had a reputation for being litigious and ruthless, and most small firms couldn't afford the resources required to fight them effectively. Finally, she found a firm in Olympia specializing in property rights and environmental law. The senior partner, a woman named Catherine Torres, had a reputation for taking on difficult cases against well-funded opponents. After several long phone calls and dozens of scanned documents sent over their unreliable satellite internet, Catherine agreed to take the case. Her fee was substantial but not impossible, and she offered a payment plan that Sarah could barely afford but would manage somehow. "Your documentation is solid," Catherine told her during a video call that kept freezing and buffering due to their inconsistent internet connection, her face pixelated and breaking up every few seconds. Sarah had to piece together her words between the technical difficulties. "But I need to be honest with you, Sarah. Pacific Coast Ventures has deep pockets and political connections that go all the way to the state legislature. They've successfully developed 3 other lighthouse properties in the past 5 years, and they've refined their approach with each one. They have a playbook for this, a strategy they've perfected. They'll file motion after motion, drag out discovery, challenge every piece of evidence, and try to bleed you dry financially and emotionally. Most families give up after 6 months when they see the legal bills piling up and no end in sight. That's exactly what they're counting on." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "I can't afford years of legal battles. I've already spent most of what I had saved just hiring you. If this drags on, I'll have nothing left. But I also can't just walk away. This island is our home. It's where my son healed from trauma that was destroying him. It's where I learned how to live again after losing my husband. It's not just property to us." Catherine's expression softened, even through the poor video quality. "I understand, and that's exactly why we need to be strategic. We fight them on every front, not just legal. Legal proceedings alone, they'll win through attrition even if we have the better case. But public opinion, environmental impact, historical preservation, media attention, those are all leverage points they're not expecting. Ravens Point is home to several protected seabird species, right? That's significant leverage. The environmental impact statement for their development will be extensive, and we can challenge it. The lighthouse is on the National Register of Historic Places, which provides certain protections. We can make this development very expensive and very public for them, turn their profit margin into a liability. These companies hate negative publicity because it affects their other projects and their ability to secure financing. If we can make Ravens Point a symbol of corporate overreach and environmental destruction, we can win this. But it's going to take work, and it's going to require you to step out of your isolation and become an advocate, a public face for this fight. Sarah felt a chill run through her. Public attention was exactly what she'd been avoiding for 3 years. The thought of putting herself and Marcus back in the spotlight, of inviting scrutiny and judgment, made her stomach turn. But what choice did she have? "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly. "Just tell me what needs to happen." Over the following weeks, Sarah transformed from a quiet lighthouse keeper into a fierce advocate for her home, a metamorphosis that both exhausted and energized her. She contacted environmental groups, spending hours on the phone explaining the ecological significance of Ravens Point. The island wasn't just home to seabirds. Harbor seals used the rocky beaches as haul-out sites during pupping season. Gray whales migrated past the island twice yearly, often stopping to feed in the rich waters nearby. The tide pools hosted diverse marine life that researchers from the University of Washington had been studying for decades. The old-growth forest on the southern part of the island contained trees that were over 300 years old, providing crucial habitat for endangered species. She reached out to historical preservation societies, documenting the lighthouse's role in maritime history. Her great-great-grandfather had saved 17 lives during his tenure as keeper, personally rowing out into storms to rescue shipwreck survivors. The lighthouse logs, which she'd preserved carefully, contained weather data and observations that scientists had used in climate studies. The structure itself was an architectural treasure, one of the last remaining examples of its particular design still in operation on the West Coast. She contacted local news outlets and initially faced polite disinterest. A property dispute between a single mother and a development company wasn't particularly newsworthy in a region where such conflicts were common, but Sarah persisted, refining her message, emphasizing the broader implications. This wasn't just about her family. It was about a pattern of behavior by Pacific Coast Ventures, about corporate entities using legal loopholes to seize properties with murky claims, about the systematic destruction of coastal ecosystems for luxury developments that benefited only the wealthy. Marcus became her partner in this effort, revealing skills Sarah hadn't known he possessed. Using his programming knowledge, he built a professional website documenting their fight. He created social media accounts and began posting daily updates. His content was compelling and authentic. Photographs of the island's wildlife, videos of the lighthouse in operation, essays about the importance of preserving wild spaces and standing up to corporate greed. He wrote about their personal story, about coming to the island as a broken child and finding healing, about what places like Ravens Point meant for people who needed sanctuary from a world that had hurt them. His posts were raw and honest in a way that resonated with people. He didn't pretend their life was perfect or romanticize island living. He talked about the isolation, the challenges, the moments of doubt, but he also conveyed the profound peace they'd found here, the way the island had given them space to grieve and heal and rebuild their lives. He positioned Ravens Point not as a personal property dispute, but as a symbol of resistance against a culture that valued profit over people, development over preservation, corporate interests over individual rights. Slowly, steadily, their story began to gain attention. Environmental bloggers picked it up, preservation societies shared their posts. People who'd never heard of Ravens Point became invested in its survival. The website Marcus built included a donation portal for their legal defense fund, and small contributions began trickling in. $5 here, $20 there, occasionally larger amounts from people who'd had their own experiences fighting developers or who simply believed in the cause. But Pacific Coast Ventures didn't sit idle while Sarah and Marcus built their campaign. The company launched its own public relations offensive, hiring a firm that specialized in managing corporate image. They produced glossy renderings of their proposed resort, stunning visualizations that made the development look like it would blend seamlessly with the natural environment. The images showed elegant buildings constructed from natural materials, extensive gardens, solar panels on every roof, and promises of sustainable practices that would supposedly enhance rather than harm the local ecosystem. They published statements painting Sarah as a selfish isolationist preventing economic development and job creation, someone standing in the way of progress because of personal attachment to property she hadn't even purchased herself but merely inherited. They emphasized the jobs the resort would create, the tax revenue it would generate for the county, the increased tourism that would benefit local businesses. They conveniently glossed over the reality that Ravens Point would be transformed from a pristine wilderness into a playground for the ultra-wealthy, that the jobs would be low-wage service positions, that the development would restrict public access to a coastline that had been viewable from the water for centuries. The tension escalated dramatically when representatives from the development company arrived on the island with a county inspector, claiming they had the right to survey the property as part of their environmental impact assessment. Sarah spotted their boat approaching and immediately radioed Catherine, who instructed her to document everything but not to physically prevent them from landing. Any hint of violence or aggression could be used against them in court. Sarah and Marcus met them at the dock, Sarah's phone recording video as the group disembarked. There were 5 people this time, 2 men in business attire completely inappropriate for island terrain, the county inspector looking uncomfortable in his official vest, and 2 people carrying surveying equipment and cameras. Sarah refused them entry beyond the dock, citing the ongoing legal dispute and the lack of any court order granting them access. "This is still private property until a court rules otherwise," she stated firmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "You're trespassing, and I'm documenting this entire encounter. You have no legal right to be here without my permission or a court order, neither of which you have." The inspector, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. "Ms. Mitchell, I understand your position, but Pacific Coast Ventures has filed for permits with the county. As part of that process, I need to conduct an environmental survey. I'm just trying to do my job here. I'm not taking sides in the legal dispute." "With all due respect, Mr. Chen," Sarah replied, "until the ownership question is resolved in court, you're attempting to survey private property without the owner's consent. That's not legal procedure, and I believe you know that. The permits Pacific Coast Ventures filed are based on a claim that this land is federal property, but they haven't proven that claim. In fact, all existing documentation contradicts it. So until a judge says otherwise, this is my property, and you don't have my permission to be here." One of the company representatives, the sharp-featured woman Sarah recognized from previous encounters, stepped forward with barely concealed irritation. "You're only delaying the inevitable," she said, her voice cold and professional. "Pacific Coast Ventures always gets what it wants. Always. We have the resources, the connections, and the legal expertise to drag this out for years if necessary. Every month you fight costs you money you don't have. Every legal filing depletes your savings. We can afford this battle indefinitely. Can you? You could make this easier on yourself by accepting our settlement offer. We're prepared to be generous, more generous than you'll get if you force this to trial and lose. Take the money, find a nice house on the mainland, give your son a normal life instead of keeping him isolated on this rock. It's really the responsible choice." Marcus stepped forward before Sarah could respond, his face flushed with anger, but his voice controlled. "My mother has already given you an answer. This island isn't for sale, and we're not interested in your blood money. You can't put a price on our home, on the place that saved our lives when we had nowhere else to go. And maybe you should be more concerned about the fact that your company's tactics are now being documented by environmental groups and preservation societies. People are paying attention to what you're doing here, to the pattern of behavior you've shown at other sites. You're not operating in the shadows anymore." The woman's expression hardened. "Careful, young man. Defamation is a serious legal matter. We have an excellent reputation in the development community, and any false statements could result in additional legal action against your mother." "Truth is an absolute defense against defamation," Marcus shot back, and Sarah felt a surge of pride at his composure. "Everything we've said about your company is documented fact, available in public records. You've pushed out at least 3 other families from Lighthouse Properties in the past 5 years using the exact same legal strategy you're trying here. You find obscure legal theories, file aggressive claims, and then wear down the property owners until they're too exhausted and broke to fight anymore. That's not defamation, that's your business model." The inspector cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I think we should leave. I'll file a report stating that access was denied, and the permit application process can continue through proper legal channels. I'm not here to mediate a dispute." He turned to the company representatives with barely disguised disapproval. "You'll need to get a court order if you want access. That's the proper procedure here." As the group retreated to their boat, the woman called back, "We'll see you in court, Miss Mitchell, and when we win, and we will win, you'll wish you'd taken our offer." Sarah waited until their boat was out of sight before her legs started shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. "You were amazing, Mom. You didn't back down." "Neither did you," Sarah replied, her voice unsteady. "Your father would have been so proud of how you stood up to them. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. These people are serious. They meant what they said about dragging this out. This fight could take years. It could cost us everything we have left. Are you sure you want to keep fighting? Because if you want to take their settlement and start over somewhere else, I'll understand. Your future matters more than this island." Marcus looked at her with absolute certainty. "Mom, this island is part of my future. Not because I necessarily want to live here forever, but because it represents something important. If we give up now, we're saying that people with money and power can just take whatever they want from people who have less. We're saying that places like this don't matter, that they can be destroyed for profit without consequences. I'm not okay with that. I can't be okay with that. So yes, I want to keep fighting, whatever it takes." Do you resent me for bringing you here? For fighting to keep us here? Marcus looked up from his dinner, surprise evident on his face. Well, no, never. This place saved my life. After Dad died, I was so angry, so lost. I was heading down a really dark path. Here, I found myself again. I learned what matters. And watching you fight for our home, seeing your strength, that's taught me more than any regular school ever could. But what about your future? College, career, relationships? I can have all of that, Marcus said. This doesn't have to be forever, but right now this is where we need to be. And we need to win this fight, not just for us, but to show that places like this, wild places, quiet places, they still have value. They matter. The legal battle dragged on through the fall and into winter, each week bringing new challenges and expenses. Pacific Coast Ventures filed motion after motion, each requiring responses that cost money and time. They challenged the validity of Sarah's grandfather's will, claiming irregularities in how it had been executed. They questioned the chain of title going back to the original 1892 deed, suggesting there had been breaks in ownership that invalidated current claims. They filed complaints with multiple government agencies, alleging that Sarah was operating the lighthouse without proper permits, that her presence on the island violated environmental regulations, that she was interfering with maritime navigation by refusing to allow Coast Guard inspections. Each allegation was baseless, easily disproven, but they still required Catherine's time to address, and time meant money. Sarah watched her savings dwindle week by week, the legal defense fund donations helping but not nearly covering the full costs. She took on additional freelance work, writing articles late into the night after maintaining the lighthouse all day, sleeping only a few hours before starting again. The stress was taking its toll, bringing back the insomnias and anxiety she'd thought she'd left behind in Seattle. Marcus noticed, of course. He'd become attuned to his mother's moods, and the worry lines that had finally faded from her face were creeping back. He tried to help by taking on more of the physical maintenance work, by researching legal precedents and case law to assist Catherine, by managing their social media campaign and responding to supporters. But he could see his mother wearing down, the light dimming in her eyes, and it terrified him. One particularly difficult evening in late November, after Catherine had called to inform them that Pacific Coast Ventures was filing yet another motion, this time attempting to get an injunction that would force them to leave the island pending the trial, Sarah broke down. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and legal documents, and finally allowed herself to cry the tears she'd been holding back for months. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted to Marcus, her voice breaking. I thought we could fight them, thought that being right would be enough, but they just keep coming. Every time we answer one filing, they submit two more. Catherine says we're winning on the merits, that our case is solid, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like drowning. I'm watching our savings disappear. I'm exhausted all the time, and I'm terrified that I've made everything worse by fighting instead of just taking their settlement when we had the chance. Marcus pulled his chair closer and took her hands. Mom, listen to me. You taught me something important when we came here. You taught me that sometimes the hard choice is the right choice, that running away isn't always weakness, and fighting back isn't always strength. You have to know which battles matter. This battle matters. Not just to us, but to everyone who's ever been pushed around by people with more money and power. We're not just fighting for Ravens Point. We're fighting for the principle that you can't just take what doesn't belong to you because you have expensive lawyers. And yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's exhausting and scary and expensive. But giving up would be harder in the long run. Because we'd have to live with knowing we surrendered when we were in the right. How did you get so wise? Sarah asked, managing a watery smile. I had a good teacher, Marcus replied. You showed me how to fight through impossible things when we first came here. You showed me that healing takes time and work and persistence. Now let me show you that I learned those lessons. We're going to get through this together, just like we got through everything else. Then, in early December, something unexpected happened that would shift the entire trajectory of their fight. A journalist from a major national news outlet contacted Sarah, explaining that he'd been following their story on social media and wanted to visit the island to do a comprehensive feature. The attention their campaign had garnered, combined with growing public interest in corporate land grabs and environmental destruction, had caught the attention of the newspaper's environmental desk. They wanted to make Ravens Point a symbol of the larger fight over coastal development and climate change, part of a series they were running on disappearing wild spaces. Sarah was hesitant at first, burned by her earlier experiences with entitled tourists and worried about inviting more scrutiny, but Catherine strongly encouraged her to accept. This kind of mainstream media attention could be a game changer, she explained. These development companies operate best in obscurity, shine a bright enough light on their practices, and they tend to retreat. Sarah agreed, and a week later, a reporter named David Chen arrived on Jim's supply boat, accompanied by a photographer named Maria Santos. Unlike the tourists who'd sparked this whole conflict, David and Maria treated the island and its residents with genuine respect from the moment they stepped onto the dock. David was a veteran environmental journalist who'd covered similar stories across the country, and his approach was thorough and empathetic rather than sensationalistic. He spent 3 days living in their guest room, a small space they'd converted from storage, documenting their daily life with a journalist's eye for detail and a human being's capacity for compassion. He rose before dawn to watch Sarah perform the lighthouse maintenance, climbing the spiral stairs with her as she checked the lens and replaced bulbs. He interviewed her about her grandfather's history with the property, about Daniel's death and their decision to leave Seattle, about Marcus's transformation from troubled child to thoughtful young man. He asked difficult questions about whether isolation was truly the answer, about Marcus's education and socialization, about the sustainability of their lifestyle, but he asked them respectfully, genuinely seeking to understand rather than to judge. Maria photographed everything: the lighthouse beacon cutting through morning fog, the seabird colonies nesting in the cliffs, Marcus working on his correspondence courses at the old wooden table, Sarah preparing dinner in their modest kitchen, the two of them standing together on the rocks watching the sunset. The images she captured were beautiful but not romanticized, showing both the harsh reality of island life and its profound peace. David also interviewed them about the legal battle, and here his questions became sharper, more investigative. He asked for documentation, for timelines, for specifics about Pacific Coast Ventures' claims and tactics. Sarah gave him access to everything, Catherine having advised that transparency was their best strategy at this point. David spent hours reviewing documents, making notes, asking follow-up questions. He was particularly interested in the company's previous developments, the other lighthouse properties they'd acquired. On his last evening, David sat with Sarah and Marcus on the porch of their cabin, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the darkening water. "I've covered a lot of stories like yours," he said quietly. "Corporate entities using legal tactics to seize properties, families fighting against impossible odds. Most of them don't end well, if I'm being honest. The companies have too many resources, too much patience. They can afford to lose battles because they know they'll win the war through attrition. But every once in a while, a story comes along that captures public imagination, that becomes about something bigger than one family's property dispute. I think yours might be one of those stories." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because you're not just fighting for yourselves," David explained. "You're articulate and sympathetic, which matters in media coverage, whether it should or not. Your story has clear heroes and villains, a mother and son healing from tragedy versus a faceless corporation. The island itself is photogenic and ecologically significant. The lighthouse provides historical weight. And, most importantly, you represent something a lot of people are feeling right now: frustration with corporate power, concern about environmental destruction, anger at a system that seems rigged in favor of the wealthy. If I can tell your story right, if I can connect your individual fight to these larger themes, we might be able to generate the kind of pressure that actually changes things." The article, when it published in late December just before Christmas, exceeded even David's predictions. It ran on the front page of the newspaper's weekend edition, a lengthy feature with Maria's stunning photographs spread across multiple pages. The headline read, "Family Fights Corporate Giant for Island Sanctuary." David's writing was powerful and evocative, painting a vivid picture of life on Ravens Point while clearly explaining the legal and environmental issues at stake. He detailed the questionable tactics Pacific Coast Ventures had employed, not just with Ravens Point, but with their previous developments. He'd tracked down other families who'd lost their properties to the company, interviewing them about the psychological and financial toll of fighting a well-funded opponent. He highlighted the environmental damage their previous resorts had caused, citing studies and expert testimony that contradicted the company's claims of sustainable development. He questioned how a company with such a problematic track record continued to receive permits and approvals from government agencies, suggesting political connections and campaign contributions that raised ethical concerns. More importantly, the article went viral in ways that traditional journalism rarely did anymore. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media, discussed on cable news programs, referenced by environmental activists and preservation groups across the country. Suddenly, Ravens Point wasn't just a local property dispute. It became a causa célèbre, a symbol of resistance against corporate overreach and environmental destruction that resonated with people far beyond the Pacific Northwest. Donations poured into the legal defense fund Catherine had established, small contributions from thousands of people who saw themselves in Sarah and Marcus's struggle, who'd had their own experiences with corporate bullying or who simply believed in the cause. Within a week, they'd raised more money than Sarah had spent on legal fees in the previous 6 months. Environmental organizations offered expert witnesses willing to testify about the ecological damage the proposed development would cause. Law professors wrote opinion pieces supporting Sarah's legal position. Politicians, sensing which way public opinion was flowing, began asking pointed questions about how Pacific Coast Ventures had obtained permits for their previous developments and whether appropriate environmental reviews had been conducted. The pressure on Pacific Coast Ventures became intense and sustained in a way they clearly hadn't anticipated. Their social media accounts were flooded with critical comments. Protests were organized outside their California headquarters. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about reputational risk and potential boycotts. The company's other projects faced renewed scrutiny, with regulators taking a harder look at permits and environmental compliance issues that had previously been rubber-stamped. Under this mounting pressure, Pacific Coast Ventures' confidence, which had seemed unshakable, began to crack visibly. Their lawyers, who had been aggressive and dismissive in every previous interaction, suddenly became more conciliatory in tone. They requested a settlement conference, something they'd refused for months when Sarah had suggested it. Catherine, sensing weakness, advised playing hardball. "They're feeling the heat," she explained during a phone call. "Don't let them sense any desperation on our end. We're negotiating from strength now." The settlement negotiations took place over video conference in mid-January with Sarah and Marcus on one side of the screen, Catherine beside them, and a team of lawyers representing Pacific Coast Ventures on the other. The company's lead attorney, a man who'd previously radiated arrogance, now seemed subdued and eager to resolve the matter quickly. They offered to withdraw their claim entirely in exchange for Sarah signing an agreement not to pursue damages for legal fees, emotional distress, or the harm their actions had caused. Catherine pushed back immediately. "My client has spent tens of thousands of dollars defending her legitimate property rights against baseless claims. She's suffered months of stress and uncertainty. Your company's actions have been documented extensively in national media, and frankly, you're lucky we're not discussing a countersuit for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. If you want to settle, we need full reimbursement of legal fees, a public acknowledgement that Sarah's ownership was never legitimately in question, and a substantial payment to a coastal preservation fund as a demonstration of good faith." The negotiations continued for 3 more sessions over the course of a week, but ultimately Pacific Coast Ventures agreed to terms that Catherine characterized as a significant victory. They would pay all of Sarah's legal fees, make a public statement acknowledging that the Mitchell family's ownership of Ravens Point was clear and uncontested, and contribute $250,000 to a coastal preservation fund. Additionally, as part of the settlement, Sarah agreed to place conservation easements on Ravens Point that would permanently prevent any future development beyond the existing structures, ensuring the island would remain protected even if she eventually sold it or passed it to future generations. On a cold January morning, Sarah signed the papers that officially ended the dispute. As she put down the pen after the final signature, she felt something release inside her, a tension she'd been carrying so long it had become part of her physical being. Ravens Point would remain in the Mitchell family, protected by conservation easements that prevented any future development. Pacific Coast Ventures would pay all of Sarah's legal fees and make a substantial donation to the Coastal Preservation Fund. It wasn't a complete victory. Sarah had wanted them held accountable for their other questionable developments, wanted criminal charges for their fraudulent claims, but Catherine reminded her that perfect justice was rare in legal disputes. This was as close as they were likely to get, and it was enough to secure what mattered most, their home. That evening, she and Marcus climbed to the top of the lighthouse, something they did regularly, but which felt especially meaningful now. The sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. The beam from the lighthouse would soon sweep across the darkening waters, a beacon that had guided ships safely for over a century and would continue to do so. "We did it," Marcus said quietly. "We actually won." "We did," Sarah agreed. "But more than that, we proved something important. That you can fight back. That money and power don't always win. That places like this, quiet places where people can heal and grow, they're worth protecting." Marcus nodded, then turned to her with a smile. "You know what the funny thing is? Those tourists, the ones who started all this by trespassing, they probably have no idea what they set in motion. If they'd just respected the no trespassing signs, none of this would have happened." Sarah laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had in years. "Maybe we should send them a thank you card." Their entitled attitude exposed a company that was exploiting coastal properties all along the West Coast. Because of what happened here, other families might be able to save their homes, too. As the months passed and spring arrived at Ravens Point, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. But Sarah and Marcus were changed by their experience. They'd learned that isolation wasn't just about removing themselves from the world, it was about creating space to grow strong enough to face it when necessary. The island had given them sanctuary when they needed it most, and in return, they'd fought to preserve it not just for themselves, but for the future. Marcus began applying to colleges, focusing on environmental law and conservation policy. He wanted to take the lessons learned on Ravens Point and use them to help others. Sarah supported this completely, knowing that their time of isolation was naturally coming to an end, but they would always have the island, a place to return to, a reminder of what they'd overcome and what mattered most. On one afternoon in late March, Sarah spotted a boat approaching the island. Her body tensed instinctively, old fears rising, but as it drew closer, she recognized the markings of the National Park Service. They'd been in contact with her for months, discussing the possibility of Ravens Point becoming part of a new coastal preservation initiative. The island would remain in Sarah's ownership, but she'd work in partnership with the Park Service to protect its ecological and historical significance. The rangers who visited were professional and enthusiastic, clearly passionate about conservation. They walked the island with Sarah and Marcus, documenting its features and discussing management plans. Unlike the developers who'd tried to exploit it or the tourists who'd treated it as their personal playground, these people understood that some places were valuable precisely because they remained wild and protected. As they stood on the cliff watching the rangers depart, Sarah felt a sense of completion she hadn't anticipated. The battle to save Ravens Point had been exhausting and frightening, but it had also connected them to a larger community of people who cared about preservation and sustainability. They weren't alone anymore, not really. They were part of something bigger. Marcus will be leaving for college in the fall, Sarah said to herself as much as to her son. The lighthouse feels like it's going to be very quiet. You could get an assistant keeper, Marcus suggested. Train someone to help with maintenance, share the responsibilities. The Park Service partnership might even fund it. Maybe, Sarah said thoughtfully. Or maybe I'll enjoy the solitude for a while. I've learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. That summer, as Marcus prepared for his departure, they made the most of their remaining time together on the island. They repaired the dock, repainted the lighthouse keeper's cottage, and documented the various seabird colonies for the Park Service's wildlife database. They also received visitors, carefully vetted groups of researchers, historians, and environmental educators who treated Ravens Point with the respect it deserved. One particularly memorable visit came from a group of teenagers participating in a coastal conservation program. Marcus, now 18 and more confident than Sarah had ever seen him, led them on a tour of the island, explaining its ecology and history. He shared their story, too, about coming here broken and finding healing, about fighting to protect what mattered. Sarah watched from a distance, pride swelling in her chest. This was who her son had become, a young man who understood the value of wild places and the importance of standing up for what was right. On Marcus's last night before leaving for college, they climbed the lighthouse one final time together. The routine was so familiar that they could navigate the spiral staircase in complete darkness, their hands finding the worn spots on the railing, their feet knowing exactly where each step began and ended. I'm going to miss this, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Every single day I'll miss this. It will always be here, Sarah assured him. Whenever you need it, whenever the world gets too loud or too complicated, Ravens Point will be waiting. That's what we fought for. I know, Marcus replied. And I promise I'll use what we learned here. I'll fight for other places like this, other families like ours. This experience, everything we went through, it showed me what I want to do with my life. The morning Marcus left, Sarah stood on the dock and watched the supply boat carry him away toward the mainland and his future. The tears came, of course, but they weren't tears of sorrow or regret. They were tears of pride and gratitude. She'd brought a broken, angry boy to this island 5 years ago, fleeing from trauma and grief. Now, she was sending a capable, compassionate young man out into the world, equipped with values and experiences that would serve him well. Alone again on Ravens Point, Sarah settled into a new rhythm. The lighthouse still needed tending, the grounds still required maintenance, and the wildlife population still needed monitoring for the Park Service. But there was also time for her writing, for reading, for simply existing in the peaceful solitude she'd first sought when she brought Marcus here. She maintained the conservation partnership with the Park Service, hosting small groups of researchers and environmental educators. Each visit reminded her that their fight hadn't been selfish or isolationist. By preserving Ravens Point, they'd protected a valuable piece of coastal wilderness, a haven for wildlife, and a place where others could come to learn and find their own moments of peace. Marcus called regularly, his voice excited as he talked about his classes in environmental policy and his internship with a nonprofit focused on coastal preservation. He'd met people, made friends who shared his passion for protecting wild places. He was thriving, just as he'd thrived on the island, but now he was using his strength to help others. In the autumn, Sarah received a letter from Catherine Torres, her lawyer. Pacific Coast Ventures had been forced to pay significant fines for environmental violations at their other developments, violations that had come to light partly because of the scrutiny their attempted takeover of Ravens Point had generated. Several families had been able to challenge similar development schemes and win. Their fight had mattered beyond just saving their own home. As winter approached and the storms grew fiercer, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Her husband's death had shattered her world, and Marcus's subsequent struggles had nearly broken her. Coming to Ravens Point had seemed like running away, an escape from problems rather than a solution. But she understood now that sometimes you needed to step away from chaos to find the strength to face it. Sometimes isolation wasn't weakness, it was necessary healing. The strangers who'd landed on their island that foggy morning nearly 2 years ago had no idea what they'd set in motion. Their casual trespassing and entitled attitude had exposed a larger pattern of exploitation and led to protections for coastal properties throughout the region. In trying to invade Sarah and Marcus's sanctuary, they'd inadvertently helped ensure that sanctuary would exist for generations to come. On a clear December night, Sarah stood at the top of the lighthouse and watched the beam sweep across the dark waters. Somewhere out there, Marcus was studying for finals, probably staying up too late in his dorm room, fueled by coffee and determination. Somewhere out there, families were living on their own small pieces of coast, protected now by precedents set in the battle for Ravens Point. And here, on this small island, where she'd once come seeking only escape, Sarah had found something far more valuable than solitude. She'd found the strength to fight for what mattered. She'd learned that healing wasn't about hiding from the world, but about creating space to become strong enough to face it. She'd watched her son transform from a troubled child into a remarkable young man. And she'd discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give up what's yours, to stand your ground against forces that seem overwhelming, and to trust that doing the right thing will matter. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, a symbol of guidance and persistence. Like that beam, Sarah and Marcus had found their purpose not in grand gestures or dramatic changes, but in the steady, consistent work of protecting something valuable. They'd been keepers in the truest sense, guardians of a place that needed them as much as they'd needed it. And when spring came again, when Marcus returned for his first visit home from college, he'd find Ravens Point exactly as he'd left it, wild, beautiful, protected. A testament to the truth that some battles are worth fighting, some places are worth saving, and some sanctuaries are worth defending with everything you have. The strangers had landed on their island not knowing who lived there. They'd found a grieving widow and her troubled son. But they'd awoken something fierce and determined, something that had been sleeping under the surface, waiting for a reason to emerge. In the end, Sarah and Marcus Mitchell had shown them, and the world, that the quiet keepers of wild places possessed a strength that money and power couldn't break. As Sarah descended the lighthouse stairs that night, she smiled at the thought. Let them come, the developers and tourists, the entitled and the greedy. Ravens Point would stand, and so would she. Some places were meant to remain wild. Some people were meant to guard them. And some stories of resistance, born from simple trespassing on a foggy morning, were meant to inspire others to stand and fight for what they loved. The lighthouse beam swept on through the darkness, steady and true, just as it had for over a century, and in its light, Sarah Mitchell, keeper of Ravens Point, guardian of Sanctuary, found her peace.